Hello everyone, Bag here, and welcome to my complete Cyrene guide. Here, we'll take a look at her builds, her teams, her playstyles, and her premium options, so that you can be a more informed player and puller than when you got here. Timestamps are below if you don't need yet another kit summary, and with that, let's get into things. Cyrene is an incredibly unique 5-star Ice Remembrance unit, so let's get into her kit. First off, Cyrene has a unique ult gauge. Like Acheron, Facial, Finon, or Castris, she can stack from 0 all the way to 27 recollection stacks, and although the actual cost of her ultimate is 12, she can't actually start using her ultimate until she first reaches 24, where she can then do 2 ults back to back. How do you get these recollection stacks? Well, her basic gives 1, and also indicates that she scales off of HP. Her skill gives 3, where it otherwise deploys a field that gives the team 24% true damage for 2 turns, and the last relevant way for now is with her talent. At the start of combat, or after whenever Cyrene takes an action, all allies, including member sprites, gain future. When an ally acts, they consume future to give Cyrene 1 recollection. This basically just means that everyone can give her a stack once per her turn. Although, member sprites don't consume future when acting, so they can just give infinite recollection if they then have infinite actions. Also note that a given unit has to take an action to give a stack. They can't just be part of an action. So joint attacks or RMC's ult don't generate extra stacks just because they have member sprites. Oh, and also her talent just gives the team 20 damage% by existing. Upon ulting for the first time, all allies gain full energy, while Cyrene then enters permanently into an enhanced state. This enhanced state gives her 50 crit rate, it makes her true damage skill field permanent, and it gives her an enhanced basic that gives 3 recollection while not generating any SP, with a single target hit followed up by an AoE hit. Cyrene's first ultimate also summons her member sprite, which is just herself. Sure, I guess. This member sprite, like Ika, doesn't appear on the action bar, and like Netherwing, it also isn't targetable by enemies. Instead, its HP bar increases and decreases alongside Cyrene's, with its HP being 100% of Cyrene's. Oh, and it also increases Cyrene's max HP by existing as well. One of the only ways Cyrene's member sprite takes an action is by Cyrene's ultimate, as not only does her ult let her member sprite act, but after her first ult, letting her member sprite act is all her ultimate does. On the member sprite's action, you can choose to do one of 2 things. For your first option, you can attack the enemy, with an AoE attack that gets extra bounces for every ally that's given her a stack of recollection, which is just to say that she gets extra bounces per ally. For option 2, her member sprite can instead buff an ally. Normally, this buff is very simple, and kinda bad, being a 40% damage buff for 2 turns. But when she's buffing a Crisis Heir, she instead gives them a unique buff that's catered to specifically them. The bounce part of Cyrene's member sprite attack is technically her own buff for herself that she automatically gets after ulting, so I don't really know why that was made a separate ability, but whatever. These buffs that she can give are either permanent, or they are a one-time thing that can be reapplied, or kinda half and half, but it'll be obvious which is which when we get into it. And so yeah, let's take a lightning round for everyone's buffs. I'll talk more about each unit in the playstyle and team sections, but let's just get familiar with each buff first. RMC gets some pretty decent buffs to their attack and crit based on Cyrene's stats, and now, whenever RMC uses their new enhanced basic attack that they get once per ult, Cyrene's member sprite automatically launches its AoE attack. Aglaia gets a buff named Romance, which is immediately consumed after her or Garment Maker attack. This buff gives 70 energy, which is 20% of her max, and 36 death shred and 72 damage% for as long as she's in her enhanced state. She also just gets full Garment Maker stacks right when the buff is applied. Tribi gets 12 death shred for herself, and her follow-ups do an extra 1 hit of additional damage. This buff kinda sucks, so let's move on. Mayday, on the other hand, gets a free instant Godslayer Be God with 200 extra crit damage in that free attack. This is absolutely absurd, and is one of Cyrene's best buffs by far. Even if he also gets a useless cleanse since he's already immune to CC, and she also action advances him if he's not in his enhanced state, which he literally always should be. But still, insane buff, especially since Mayday doesn't really have the best teammate options at base. Castris can overcharge Newbud up to 200%, with every 1% overcharge giving 0.24% extra scaling to the bounces of Netherwing's explosions. If there are 2 or 1 enemies on the field when Netherwing is summoned, that 0.24% becomes 0.72%. Here is some quick math showing that even though the breaths before the explosion are not buffed, it's still technically efficient to let Newbud overflow, but still spamming the explosion instead does offer other benefits such as proccing her signature's action advance. Anoxa gets 1 SP and 100% action advance, and for 1 turn, he gets 3 extra bounces on his skill per skill, and every erudition unit including himself gets 60% attack and 40 damage%. This buff does stack with Ceredra's Peerage, totaling to 32 bounces in 1 turn, making this a very potent buff when you can line it up with Peerage. Also, this is really not worth using with the Herda, but it's there if you want to, even if I wouldn't recommend it. Hyacine doesn't need to be targeted, and instead, she gets her buff whenever Cyrene's member sprite acts at all. In doing so, she gets 2 stacks of Ode to Sky, with each stack being consumed with her skill or ult. Consuming a stack causes that ability to give Ika 72 22% more tally to its damage that scales off of Hyacine and Ika's healing. And also, if Hyacine is targeted, they get 24 energy. Hooray! Cypher gives 20% Death Shred to the patron and 12 Death Shred to everyone else, while also getting 36 damage percent. This is a very good, very potent buff that's weakened by the fact that she's not best in slot for a single Crisis Air carry. RIP. Finon, TLDR, gets 16 crit rate, 36 crit damage at E0 or 72% at E6, and now his territory does not end. He does his exit attack on his 8th turn, and then just kinda doesn't exit, while then gaining the Force Scourge that usually comes from entering his territory. In exchange for the permanent territory, he now loses 15% of his current HP every turn. He also gets 5 random bounces of very small hits of fire damage added onto all of his hits in his territory. Hysolence gets the same type of buff as Aglaia, with a consumable buff that gives 60 energy after attacking. And by the way, it works like this so that the energy doesn't overcap with Cyrene's first ult that already gives full energy. Hysolence also gets 120 damage percent, and now her basic and skill can now proc dots on the enemy, with her skill having a higher scaling on all enemies compared to what Kafka's skill does on only her skill's primary enemy. Ceridra gives 30 crit damage to the ally with military merit, and ending Peerage gives her 1 charge, essentially lowering her charge cost to 5. This is a pretty whatever buff, but Ceridra already gets a pass through actually being pivotal to at least 1 Crisis Air here. Sorry again, Cypher. Evanite gets a small 18 damage percent buff on Evi's explosion, her skill and ultimate give 1 extra Memoria, and her crit damage buff to ally member sprites has been buffed by 12%, so a 50% increase by going from 24% to 36%. Dipped also doesn't need to be targeted, where the bondmate permanently gets 24 damage percent, Soul Dragon's next 3 attacks are enhanced, with a bit of extra scaling on the bondmate's shield strength, and if Dipped is targeted, Soul Dragon gets action advanced by 100%, with a free AoE attack that provides a 50% beefier shield. And lastly, to touch back on Cyrene's free buff to herself, she also gets a stacking resource named Story, where she gets 1 stack after ulting, and 1 more for summoning her member sprite. This basically just means 2 stacks on her first ult and 1 for every other one. At 3 stacks, Cyrene's member sprite does a free AoE attack, which at the very least is relevant for triggering her Lycon's full effect. Whew, that was a lot, and we aren't even done with her kit yet. Hooray! Firstly, her minor traces give crit damage, speed, here's her base speed by the way, and HP. We already talked about her first trace, but her second trace is uber important. When there are either Crisis Air or Remembrance allies on the team, Cyrene gets a differing amount of starting recollection. This doesn't include herself, so for this to be maxed out, she needs a full team filling this condition. Her third trace gives the team another 20 damage percent if she's over 180 speed, and also she gives herself 2% Ice Res Pen for every 1 speed over 180, with a cap of 240 speed. Like with Hyacine, you aren't really expected to reach anywhere near this cap, and overall, this extra Ice Res Pen is kind of whatever in the grand scheme of things, although there are reasons to min-max her speed, as we'll get into. And finally, her technique simply starts combat with her skill field up. It doesn't use her skill like with Dipped, Ceridra, or Ranmei, it just starts combat with the field like Tribi or Frushwan. For leveling priority, her member sprite talent that dictates her buff's potency is an obvious priority, although the other member sprite talent that scales the AoE attack doesn't really need to be maxed out, as depending on the team, her personal damage can be highly variable. Max her skill for the true damage field, max her talent for the damage percent buff, and well, leveling her ultimate just increases the free crit rate she gets, so again with her damage you don't have to max it, but of course it's always better if you do, and the same logic goes for her basic, that also levels her enhanced basic. So, how do you play Cyrene? That's a bit of a loaded question, as thanks to her unique buffs, she can fill very different roles on the team, but I'll try to be general to start out. There are 2 main phases to Cyrene's gameplay, ramping up to her first ult, and then spending her ultimates afterwards. For that first half, by far the largest weakness in Cyrene's kit is her slow ramp up time to get to 24 stacks. To get there, Cyrene not only needs optimal recollection generation from her team, but she also needs to consume skill points like no tomorrow, to then get the 3 recollection per turn from her skill. So let's calc this out. If Cyrene skills 3 times in a cycle, and she has a maxed out second trace, she'll give herself 15 recollection stacks by the end of the first cycle, meaning to get a 1 cycle ult, she'll need 9 stacks from her allies. If units have innate Von Wax in their kits, like RMC or Dipped, or if they have an innate action at the start of combat, like Ceridra or Dipped, or if they are just naturally faster than Cyrene, like Hyacine or maybe Cypher, then that unit can naturally generate 3 stacks per cycle. So if we say you have 2 of these units on a team, as Ceridra and RMC are pretty common here, and both Crisis Air Sustains are here too, then that would leave the carry to generate the last 3 stacks. This is usually not that possible since most carries act twice per cycle, but there are 2 other things to consider. For one, after Cyrene's third turn in a cycle, you can then act with another unit to get the last stack, just barely staying within that cycle. This is also how units like Tribi can get 3 stacks in a cycle, since her follow-ups are relatively easy to trigger on command. Or for another fringe case, if Cyrene naturally has a tiny bit more than 200 speed, and the carry is around 133.4 speed, Cyrene's third turn comes before their second, meaning if the carry then ults in between her second and third turn, then they can generate 3 stacks in one cycle. This can also be done if both Cyrene and the carry are slower than the speed threshold, and are then brought up by DDD. But also, there are Mem sprites. Ika and Mem can generate about 3 stacks in the first cycle, depending for Mem on how many action advances it gets, and on how many AoE attacks it can get out that are not interrupted by its action advance. So if a team has both of them, we can now comfortably get Cyrene's first ult in the first cycle, assuming Cyrene takes 3 turns in that first cycle. And even if Cyrene is too slow for 3 turns here, we'd still just barely be fine even with 2 skills. Although if we still want to ensure Cyrene takes 3 turns anyways, like if a team actually does need the extra stacks, then things can become a bit dicey. 200 speed can be difficult to hit naturally depending on the gear, so otherwise we would need to rely on DDD from Ceridra or Tribi, Von Whack, or we can spice things up with an RMC action advance. Action advancing her with RMC is actually a very viable strat, as thanks to Cyrene's free ults from her first ult, RMC can get a very easy second action advance in the first cycle thanks to all that free energy and the free RMC ult, meaning that RMC can then action advance and buff the carry just in time for them to start doing damage. Because Future is given to all allies after Cyrene's action ends, her taking back-to-back turns from Mem means that you would need to sneak units actions in between her turns to get that once per turn recollection stack. Recollection stacking in general is obviously slightly different on every team. Anoxa with Dipped and Ceridra can get to 24 stacks barely, assuming that whole ulting in between her second and third turn while going after her third turn thing. Otherwise, Hyacinth is needed to fill in the gap. Maide usually gets Tribi, Ceridra, or RMC, and Hyacinth, so he's fine here. Aglaya either gets RMC or starts with a 3-stack deficit by using Sunday, but she has Garment Maker being action advanced by Sunday to help out as well. Frontline teams are really strict here, and essentially rely on RMC action advancing Cyrene to get anything done. Heislin's teams with Kafka are kinda just screwed and won't get a fast Cyrene ult, and Full Remembrance teams just kinda don't have a problem here thanks to all of their Mem sprites. So in any case, the basic advice is to ration out ultimates, or other out of turn actions, to make sure you do hit 1 action per Cyrene turn, especially if you are action advancing Cyrene, which you can also do with Sunday on Aglaya teams by the way. Even if you do get her ult within the first cycle, it's still a very large possibility that your team doesn't clear the first wave in the first cycle anyways, if the giant bursts of damage from Cyrene's ult being applied isn't enough. If Cyrene is losing you a cycle over her competition here, then that's like really bad. But if she's matching supports by taking a cycle, then yeah, it's not the end of the world. And in Pure Fiction, APOC, and Anomaly Arbitration, since the first cycle there is 300 action value, the same basic principles apply where you just want to get within her first ult as fast as possible, even if there isn't a strict cycle-based threshold to stay within. One last thing to mention about her ramp-up time is that, if it's possible, you should try to use expensive ults before popping Cyrene's ult. Full energy from her free ult is a big deal for the likes of Castris, Ebonite, or Aglaya, so if you can afford to while staying in the cycle, saving Cyrene's first ult until you, say, summon Netherwing can give you literally an extra dragon's worth of damage. But okay, let's say it's near the end of the first cycle. You just got your Cyrene ult and a lot of things are happening at once. Everyone gets a free ult and you now have 2 Cyrene ults. So now you have to decide how to divvy up her ults. Basically, 1 ult should always go to your carry. Every carry only cares about Cyrene because of this buff. And if you want to clear within this first cycle, they're gonna need a lot of help to make up for her ramp up time where they didn't do a lot of damage. The main question is for the repeatable buffs. Do you spam the buffs on Anoxa, Aglaya, Heislins, and Maide, or do you give a buff to Ceridra, RMC, Cypher, and Tribi? Really, there is no absolute correct answer here. The general rule of thumb is that the shorter the fight is, the less worth it will be to take something like Ceridra's minor crit damage buff. But if a fight is longer, then that buff will add up over time. With Anoxa, Aglaya, and Heislins, it's best to ration out Cyrene's buff to not waste it. Anoxa's buff shouldn't be spammed consecutively in the first place, since it gives an action advance and its buff lasts for 1 turn, but its buff is also at its best when combined with Ceridra's peerage. So waiting for Anoxa to get peerage before action advancing him is ideal, and generally you want to avoid getting peerage on Anoxa during his turn, since then you have to either waste Anoxa's action advance from Cyrene's buff, or you waste Ceridra's peerage without buffing it with Cyrene. Aglaya and Heislins have energy tied to their buffs, so if they don't need the energy to stay within an ult rotation, save the buff and apply it later. Maide just kinda spams his free Godslayer Be Gods, so go wild on him, I guess. Finon enters his territory permanently after Cyrene's first ult, since that then gives him a free ult, so it's entirely worth it to spend 1 buff on him and 1 buff on Ceridra. The last chunk of units is the Full Remembrance team, where literally all of them have permanent buffs that don't need to be reapplied. For them, Ebonite and Castris should take the first 2 buffs, and the third buff for Ebonite teams can be given to whatever third teammate you have. I'm hesitant to say that RMC is worth buffing that much outside of Ebonite teams, but here you might as well. Lastly, the sustains really should never be targeted, as you're going to to get so much less out of their small boons over just targeting the carry or doing an AoE attack. I guess if the team is about to die, Dip's emergency large shield can be nice, and if Casterus is close to her next dragon that she needs to finish a fight with, then maybe giving Hyacinth 24 energy can give her another ult to close that gap. These are fringe cases to be sure, and they're ones that aren't really worth considering. Anyways, from then on, things are pretty simple. The rules on whether to wait or spam with her ult doesn't really change past her initial 2 uses. Beyond the basics of try not to overkill enemies with a giant hit if you would otherwise clear within that cycle anyways without the giant hit, and also don't needlessly overflow energy. In her enhanced state, she becomes entirely SP neutral, so it's much easier to play a team rotation around her ults without needing to feed her SP every turn. Most Crisis air carries are also relatively comfortable with SP, so her SP consumption is not usually as bad of a problem as you might expect. The main worries with Cyrene is getting to this point. Once she is past her ramp up time, it's honestly just pretty smooth sailing with her buffs. I'll plug here to subscribe. If you want coverage like this for any upcoming unit in 4.x, or really her name is the Dahlia, okay, well then stick around and subscribe. A good super majority of viewers still aren't subscribed, so if you would be so kind as to make the funny number go up, then that would be really cool of you. I don't know. Anyways, back to the vid. Now for gearing Cyrene, things are a bit iffy. The main set to go for is the one that was made for her. Deliver gives some crit, some HP, and it eventually gives the team 15 damage percent. The main thing to consider instead is just to go 2-piece speed, if your team's rotation really needs her to be 200 speed. Again, with RMC and or Hyacinth, this usually isn't that big of a deal, as there is a bit of wiggle room depending on Ika and Mem's actions. So if you don't need to lose the 15 team-wide damage percent to stay within a cycle, or if you just don't care about staying in the cycle, then just go for her set. For planers, she also has an obvious choice with the new Amphoria set, giving the team 8% speed when her Member Spy is on the field. Now, only one teammate can provide this buff, and since Cyrene's Member Spy isn't on the field until her ramp up time is over, giving this to RMC or maybe even Hyacinth instead can be a better idea for the sake of Cyrene's speed. If you're doing that, then the standard options of Keel, Lushaka, or Penacony are all here depending on what the team wants. If your priority is her damage, then either Bone Collection or Arcadia are best, with Arcadia becoming better if she is on a full Remembrance team. And if you care about her speed, any 2-piece speed set gives her about 6 extra speed, which isn't bad at all. You can also go Von Whack to really solve her Cycle 1 speed problems, although then she'll be so fast that she will outrun units who rely on going before her in their first turn, like Hyacinth and RMC, although they'll then be able to act after her third turn, so this is more delaying generating their third stacks with their turn in the cycle more than anything else. For stats, Speed Boots is a no-brainer, as is HP Rope since ER doesn't work on her. From here, you can go HP Orb and Body for the sake of better casters charging. As with what I've said before, her damage does matter, but it's not really the most important utility that she's bringing in most teams. A crit damage Body Chest and an ice damage Orb will be marginally better for her damage, but to be real, I just don't think there's going to be that much of a difference with your performance with what you pick here, frankly. Full Remembrance teams, and more specifically Ebonite carry teams, are where her damage can really shine, but even there, it's not worth picking a better main stat if it means losing too much speed. Just remember either way that you only need 50 crit rate, since her enhanced state gives her another free 50%. Although with how many substats that are going to speed, a crit rate body might still be needed depending on your roles. For stats to go for, her speed is something we've gone over a lot. 180 is the bare minimum for her damage percent buff, and after that it depends on if you have DDD on the team, in which case all you need is 180, or do you need her to be faster than an 133.4 speed carry, in which case being a bit faster than 200 speed is needed. Or if you just need her to skill 3 times per cycle, then nothing above 200 is required. Or if you don't care about 3 skills in one cycle, then we're back to anything above 180 is just for the extra ice res pen. Other than that, a good crit ratio and HP substats are a secondary goal. Min-maxing it is smart, but never go for more damage stats if it means compromising your team's rotations. For light cones, there's really only 3 options. First, let's talk about her signature. It gives 18% speed, as well as 10% vulnerability and 16% crit damage to the team when the wearer's Member Sprite uses its skill on enemies and allies respectively. After obtaining both buffs, their effects are also increased by 60%, so 16% vulnerability and 25.6% crit damage. You get a free AoE attack on the enemies after spending Cyrene's first 2 ults, so this basically just means that you get the full effect after its ramp up time. Now, comparing this to the free Her Destroy Light Cone, that gives 12% speed and 16% damage bonus to the team. So if we say crit damage and damage percent are weighed equally, the signature gives 6% speed, 16% vulnerability, and about 9% more of the competitive stat. 16% vulnerability is not bad at all, as that will likely be a direct 16% damage increase for the team after her ramp up time, assuming you don't already have sources of vulnerability, such as from Ebonite's ult state or from Hycelin's skill. That being said, usually you would want a signature to either open new possibilities for the team, or for it to be a larger damage increase than around 16%. The light cone's 6% extra speed does make it easier to get to 200 speed, but again there are a lot of ways around just getting 200 speed while still getting her ult in the first cycle. And speaking of that first cycle, not having any buff from this light cone for that entire time is pretty rough, since the first wave can be a very tight damage window to clear within that cycle. Although on the other side of things, since Cyrene can't use her skill in her enhanced state, the buff from the Hertastore light cone then can't be reapplied. So either way she's losing out on some important stats here, either before or after her ramp up time. I would say this light cone is rather skippable. It is a strong damage upgrade, but in most teams that she is a part of, there's usually a better option to go for first. Besides her signature and the Hertastore light cone that is otherwise her default choice, the other main option is Hyacin's signature, also giving 18% speed, while giving 18% vulnerability this time, while then also giving the HP draining niche that we all know and love. Now this isn't the most important niche for her to fill, since Hyacin is oftentimes played with her, and the teams that want this light cone stacked to its max mostly don't want Cyrene, aka Blade or Jingliu teams. But if you do have a second copy lying around, then yes, it's actually really good on her, especially for Evernight teams that still really appreciate the extra HP drains. Granted, the uptime here for the vulnerability will be a lot worse than with Hyacin, but whatever, it's still a good option if you have it. For teams, well, I already have a half-an-hour video on her teams that I'm sure most of you have already probably seen, so I'm just going to give a very quick TLDR here. Essentially, Cyrene is usually the last piece of the puzzle for her teams, and she usually relies on one or two quintessential teammates that makes her worth running on a team in the first place. Anoxa's new best in slot team is with her, but without Ceridra it's kind of just whatever. For all attack scalers, Dipped can be better, even without Sunny's synergy, but as we went over in the playstyle section, if you can't gear and play around his slower generation, then Hyacin will always be the more safe and comfortable option if you have her. My day really wants Hyacin alongside her, but otherwise RMC, Tribi, or Ceridra are all great last options. Aglaya is fine with replacing Ho-Ho with Dipped thanks to Cyrene's energy buff, and Sunday or RMC can both work, but Sunday is still ultimately better. Casterus likes her as an overall upgrade to E1 Tribi, although the overall severity of that depends largely on the enemy count, whereas Evernight carry gets a more substantial boost from her, although for both of them, I would say Cyrene is not worth getting until you first get the other pieces of their cores. Hysolins can make Kafka-less teams work, especially at E1, thanks to RMC or Ceridra giving Hysolins extra skills for more dot procs and energy, but Kafka teams are the default that then struggle with their rep up time more than any other team. And then Phylon teams are basically always running this exact team, but in general, I personally am a big doubter for her to be worth it here over just running his standard core. Again, Cyrene is literally never the first unit that you would get for a team to make it work, nor is she ever really that missing piece that makes a team truly work on a new level, except maybe for Maide. She's a bit of a luxury pick that can boost teams if she is both properly catered to for her ramp up time and buff synergies, and if said ramp up time doesn't end up negatively impacting your run too much. So no, she's not a terrible unit that is never worth pulling, and it is nice that she can be viable in so many different teams, but at the very least, is it worth it to pull for a unit when they are for sure not getting any more synergies in the future, and are probably releasing at the peak of their strength? Yeah, that's pretty rough and hard to justify, I'll give Doom Posters that. Finally, we have her Eidolons, which are something, I'll say that. Her E1 makes it so that whenever you consume story and get a free AoE attack from Cyrene's Member Sprite, Cyrene gains 6 recollection while adding 12 more bounces to the attack. This is a decent Eidolon. The extra 6 recollection slightly lowers the interval between story consumptions from 36 recollection to 30, and the extra damage from the bounces is nothing to scoff at. 6 extra recollection can also then contribute to higher personal damage or a faster spamming of her repeatable buffs onto the likes of Maide. Though really, none of these benefits are quite at the level that an E1 ought to be at, just really due to how infrequently this effect is triggered. This Eidolon mostly just shines in something like an Evernight team, where focusing on Cyrene's personal damage while uber funneling her with recollection can lead to a very strong showing of her damage. But for most of the cases, the most important thing about her E1 is that it gets her closer to her E2. Her E2 starts her out with an extra 12 recollection, meaning with a maxed out second trace, she starts out with 18. Also, you get a stacking addition to her true damage buff for each ally that she's buffed, capping to an extra 24%. So an eventual raw 24% true damage buff is already pretty great, but the real draw is the shortened ramp up time. As most of this video has shown, there are ways to work around her ramp up time to make it not as debilitating as it otherwise could be, but her Eidolon ensures that her ramp up time is a complete non-issue. So for modes with rolling action value, aka every mode except for MOC within its first wave, this will be a serious improvement for your overall clear speed. Like I said in my initial impressions on Cyrene, I don't think that she is an E2 bait unit. She's not worthless at E0, and she doesn't need her E2 to function. But it is also a game changer Eidolon, and one that makes any awkwardness from slotting her in on a Crisis Air team completely disappear. Her E4 gives a stacking multiplier increase onto her AoE attack that can stack up to 24 times for an extra 144% scaling at max stacks. It will take a very long time for this to max out, but even getting halfway is still a pretty nice damage increase. Her damage is at its best both when she has RMC's buff active, and in full remembrance teams where not only are her buffs set it and forget it, but most teammates also buff her back. There, this is actually not bad, especially for E4 standards, but obviously it's not worth it for how costly it is. And her E6 gives her an 100% action advance with her first ult, and every time story is consumed, the resulting free AoE attack either gives an extra 20 death shred while the member sprite is alive for the first time this effect is triggered, or for every other time it gives the team an S5 DDD proc. A free Robin ult, 20 death shred, and occasional DDD procs are all well and good, but for an E6 I do find this to be a bit underwhelming. The one Robin ult you get would occur within the first wave, which you already likely won't need thanks to her E2. And from there, 20 death shred and a few DDD procs per fight is just not worth 7 copies of her. Good by itself, not worth the cost, yeah, you get the gist of it by now. And that's everything. Going to the channel member corner, we have Pyro and Love as our next new member. Thank you so much for joining us, and with that, I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Bye!